I am going to attempt to do something that hasn't been done yet. When I was invited almost a year ago to consider being a part of this gathering, and then even fairly recently, I was told by Chad pretty straightforwardly, we want to leave at least 15 and up to 30 minutes for questions at every event. No one has yet accomplished that. I think 12 is maybe the most that anybody has had. 30, that would be ridiculous. They already got me up here 7 minutes late, and you do not want to go beyond 5:15 and 2 seconds. But I do want to see if I can't leave a good 15 minutes. That means stopping by 5 for questions. This will also be different in a couple of other ways. It is the first talk that is entirely about a part of the Bible. And maybe that's a good way to end the conference, because I know all of my co-presenters are thoroughly committed to the authority of Scripture. It also is a talk with a whole raft of PowerPoint slides. I was kind of pleasantly surprised that we've had as little PowerPoint as we've had thus far, because PowerPoint can be numbing. And maybe this will appear that way to you, but not because I'm out trying to sell books. But my newest book is very creatively titled The Historical Reliability of the New Testament. And so I want to walk you through just a whole barrage of topics and go into detail on nothing. But maybe whet your appetite for the book or other books related to the topic where you can get more information. This is one of the rare times that I will attempt to multitask, because the remote and my computer are not in sync. So we'll see how often I can remember to push both buttons. But that's kind of hard to see back there, as small print as I put on my slides. And I don't want to talk to you standing looking like this the whole time. Different issues pertain to different parts of the New Testament. I'm just going to start with the first 3 books and move straight through, and then turn to some questions that involve all of the New Testament at once. The Synoptic Gospels, which refers to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first 3, so-called because you can make a synopsis of them, put them in parallel columns. More often than not, a passage is paralleled in one of the others. You can compare and contrast them. When were they written, and by whom? The first question that many classical scholars will ask with some ancient text in trying to get a feel on how they should treat it. I've got these all animated, but I'm just going to pretty consistently put up an entire slide at once. Early church tradition ascribes Mark to a companion of both Peter and Paul, probably best known for abandoning Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey in the book of Acts. Not somebody who would have been a likely candidate for an invented tradition that he wrote a gospel. Luke was Paul's beloved physician in King James English. His sometime traveling doctor, but otherwise a fairly obscure character, and again, not a likely candidate for authorship. Matthew was one of the 12 apostles. good pedigree, but as a converted tax collector, maybe along with the converted zealot Simon at the opposite end of the ideological spectrum, somebody with a more dubious background. Really only John, who didn't write one of the synoptic gospels, but wrote the fourth gospel, is the only character that would have been a natural candidate if I wanted to fictitiously ascribe a gospel to somebody else. When were they written? Well, it depends on who you ask. Conservative dates, for which if we had more time we could go into the arguments, usually put Mark in the late 50s or early 60s, Matthew in the early 60s, Luke in the early or mid 60s, John to the 80s or 90s. More liberal dates, we'll put Mark into the late 60s or early 70s, Matthew into the 80s, Luke in the 80s, John into the 90s. And we could debate the relative merits of the case for each of those columns, but what's significant is that they are all first century dates. They are all dates within the lifetimes of those who were the youngest at the time of the life of Jesus to be among his followers who lived to the oldest ages. And therefore, they are never more than 2 generations for those who didn't live that long or who weren't born as late. And they are never more than 2 individuals away from eyewitness testimony. It's true that the more liberal approaches to the Gospels typically say, we're not sure Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John did write these Gospels. There's reasons to think they were followers of those 4 men, perhaps a generation later. But all that does is move things one person later from eyewitness tradition. When you compare this information with what we have for most other periods of ancient history, biography, the lives of the great philosophers, kings, emperors, and so on, this is remarkably close to the people and the time period involved. But that alone doesn't prove everything that was written was accurate. We have to ask the question of how the Gospels were composed. And some of you will have seen a chart like this. It's not the only model. It's the most common solution to what some call the synoptic problem, and the problem is just how are the Gospels interrelated. The majority of scholars will tell you Mark was written first. Matthew and Luke each followed Mark at places, went their own way at other places. There are about 235 verses where Matthew and Luke share the same information, usually sayings of Jesus that aren't found in Mark, and people have wondered if that came from a shorter document that collected those sayings, a source document. The German word for source is Quelle, which is where Q comes from, and it has nothing to do with James Bond. And then there's remaining material that's unique to Matthew and unique to Luke, and we abbreviate that as M&L. And some people think that those might have been documents, others think they were oral traditions, but this is the most common model. There is a literary relationship of some kind, but alongside of that, there had to be oral tradition, because this is a world in which it was an oral culture, very difficult with our print-based culture, whether real or virtual, to think about growing up, maybe not always even learning to read or write. That didn't make you dumb, it just meant your culture was different. There were Jewish boys that by the time they became men, age 13, well, lifespans were shorter also, had large portions of the Hebrew Scriptures committed to memory. That's what we call the Old Testament. My girls, who I think are pretty bright, but never set out to memorize Scripture, did, when they were in middle and high school, respectively, have the entire music and libretto words memorized to Les Mis, Phantom of the Opera, Man of La Mancha, and the collected works of VeggieTales. I don't think that quite adds up to as much as the Old Testament, but it's a pretty impressive accomplishment because they never set out to memorize a single word. They just heard it, and the rest of us heard it over and over and over. And thank goodness 3 of the 4 had good music. There was also social memory. Bart Ehrman likes to use the example of the child's game of telephone as to how quickly information can be garbled. But he could not have picked a less relevant analogy on the face of the planet. Because ancient oral tradition was always public, out loud, social, with groups of people advocating a certain perspective present, with the right and responsibility to interrupt and correct the speaker if he accidentally said something wrong. And I have been in modern groups and even churches where after a period of time, because part of the ethos is to tell the story of God's work in bringing this church into existence and to where it is today, that if you hang around for 6 months, nobody has ever asked you to memorize that information, but you could repeat that story in some detail. And that's just a microcosm of what was at work here. But did the gospel writers think that they were writing something of a historical or biographical genre? I think the answer to that question has to be yes as well. And you can read again, if you don't recall, the first 4 verses of the Gospel of Luke, where Luke says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us." At least that probably means Mark and Matthew. Maybe if Q existed, it meant that. Maybe a variety of other shorter documents, collections of bits of teaching about Jesus' life. Maybe the core of what would later become some of the false or apocryphal Gospels. We don't know, but Luke knew there were other written accounts about Jesus. He was aware of them. He himself interviewed those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And then he made a selection. And he put what he chose to include in a certain order, an orderly account, so that a man by the name of Theophilus, probably his patron, financed this detailed and costly enterprise, might know the certainty of the things he had been taught. If you go to the writings of Josephus, the late first century Jewish historian, or backwards in time to the classic Greek historians, Herodotus or Thucydides, these are the kinds of prologues that they write. This is how you tell somebody you're not writing a historical novel, you're not writing sheer fiction, you're not writing an epic narrative. Epics were always in poetry. You're writing history or biography. But what about all the contradictions? Well, if by that you mean that the Gospels are not word for word the same, obviously they're not. If they were, there'd be no need for more than one of them. I've put together a three slides that start from fairly insignificant differences and work their way to slightly greater differences. And you judge for yourself if you think these are problematic. It may just be how Jesus' teaching is worded. A couple of examples there. It may be how God's words are worded. It may be the order in which the parts of a story are narrated. But before we go any further, we have to realize that this was an age in which nobody had yet invented a quotation mark or had any felt need for one, and as long as you were true to an author's meaning, you could put his or her words in your words, and there was not the virtue that often is attached today to telling stories in exact chronological order. You could arrange them in topical or thematic order, and often did. Sometimes it's a case of one gospel simply not including as much as another. Either one has added a bit more teaching or detail, or has abbreviated. The story of Jairus' daughter's resurrection is a great example. Mark has a version about twice as long as Matthew, in which Jairus says to Jesus, literally, "My daughter is at her end." He gets interrupted by the woman with the flow of blood. By the time he's dealt with her and turns back to Jairus, a servant comes from the household and says, "Don't trouble the teacher, the girl has just died." And Matthew telescopes that all down to just one statement: she's just died. The ancients wouldn't have batted an eye at that. Perfectly acceptable way to tell the story. For some people, the bottom line issue is, what do non-Christians tell us about Jesus and the Gospels? There are about a dozen writers, people like Josephus, various traditions that were eventually written down in the Jewish Talmud, Greek writers Lucian and Mara ben Serapion, Romans with household names like Thales, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Pliny. I know you've been thinking about those for your next child or grandchild. Or not. And if you put together what these writers all say about Jesus, you get a composite that reads something like this. He most assuredly existed. He was a Jew. He lived in Israel in the first third of the first century. He was born out of wedlock. As an adult, his ministry intersected with that of a man by the name of John, who baptized people, calling them to repent from their sins. He gathered disciples. 5 of them are named. He frequently taught controversial interpretations of the Jewish law and eventually ran afoul of the authorities. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. That enables us to date it very specifically to the decade between 26 and 36 when Pilate reigned in Judea. And yet, despite that ignominious execution reserved for slaves and criminals, his followers believed that they saw him alive from the dead, and that meant he was indeed the Jewish Messiah, And people very quickly began in a regular series of public gatherings to sing hymns to him as if he were a god. Now you say that's not a lot of information about Jesus, but it's certainly enough to debunk those that say he never lived. And in a world before anybody dreamed of the widespread impact that he would have, and in a world in which most biographies were written of people in official positions of political or military or religious power, it's about the amount of press you might expect him to have gotten. But then there's the Gospel of John. And I'm not doing this well because I started the slide and never finished it. And there's all those other names. I started off okay for the first few, but why is the Gospel of John so different? About 80% of what John includes is not paralleled in the other four. Are the pictures too different for both of them to be credible? Well, a lot of my answer here comes in one single chart that looks like an alien by the time you get all the parts up. I think there's one more to go, two more to go. We don't know about all of these details. Some of them have question marks by them. They're more speculative than others. But if you put most of the suggestions about what happened between Jesus' death in 30 AD and the final publication of the Gospel of John about 60 years later, you get something along these lines, that John the Apostle was an eyewitness of Jesus during his lifetime, that he began to preach about him, but in awareness of what others were preaching as well, the common kerygma. Kerygma is just the Greek word for proclamation. That there is at least some evidence that there was a written document of the 7 miracles or signs found in the Gospel of John, maybe written as early as the 50s. More speculatively, that there may have been other documents, or that John may have used Mark right at the tail end for the story of Jesus' passion. But then you have 40 years or so of John putting his own stamp on how he tells the story in oral preaching. There may have been an initial draft of the 4th gospel that was finalized by someone after John's death. If you read the final verses of John, we won't take the time to do that. But there certainly were new challenges in and around Ephesus, where the church says John was written to, of the beginnings of a syncretistic movement called Gnosticism, combining various Christian insights and beliefs with Greek philosophical beliefs. It was a time when, on balance, average Jews were rejecting their own people who came to follow Jesus as Messiah and excommunicating them from the synagogues. All of these lead to the need for a very different set of contents and style, and that's exactly what we see in the gospel. But it's interesting, if you go through, especially the longer discourses of John, with a good knowledge of the contents of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you may not find verbal parallels, but you'll find that the topics regularly remind you of something Jesus taught about in different words in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's not a totally different person as if you juxtaposed Alexander the Great in one account and Caesar in another. Some of the most dramatic examples of John's distinctives, those 7 I am sayings. I am the light of the world and the bread of life and the true vine and the way, the truth, and the life and the resurrection and the life and others have conceptual parallels. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus calls the disciples the light of the world, reflecting his own light, perhaps. And someone says, well, there's nothing in the synoptics like that magnificent passage in John 8, climaxing in verse 58, where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. And that wasn't bad grammar. That was referring to the I am of the burning bush in Exodus 3:14. But when Jesus walks on water in Mark and Matthew, and the disciples see him, he says, fear not, I am. We usually see it translated, I am he, and that's a legitimate way of rendering it, but it's the same Greek, ego eimi, I am. When you start looking for parallels, there's more there than you see at first glance. There's also a rather amazing passage in both Matthew and Luke. I've printed the Matthew text here, that scholars have often called the Johannine thunderbolt. The thunderbolt from the Johannine sky dropped in the middle of the Synoptic Gospels, where Jesus says, all things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. And then he goes on to those famous words, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest, take my yoke, and so forth. It's amazing how many times in the Gospel of John you will find teachings and discourses that repeat one or more of the clauses of this solitary verse, which is a reminder that both John and the Synoptics are extracting from a much larger potential volume of information about Jesus, and for various reasons have chosen to go in separate ways. The very fact that John is not literarily dependent on Matthew, Mark, or Luke, the way those three have a relationship with each other accounts for a lot of these distinctives. But when you start slowing down, Dr. Groothuis talked about reading slowly and looking for what you might miss if you were going faster, you find some of these remarkable similarities. Interestingly, and there are entire books written on the archaeology of the Gospels alone, when you come to John, even though he is so different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the greatest amount of archaeological discoveries related to the Gospels most directly impinge on John. Both the pools described in John 5 and John 9, Bethesda and Siloam, have been excavated. You can go as a tourist to Israel and see them. It was in Israel where the first inscriptional evidence of Pontius Pilate in 1961 was unearthed. It was there where in 1968 a small bone box or ossuary was exhumed of some Jewish man from the first century named Yohanan, who apparently was crucified because there was an ankle bone and a piece of wood and a nail joining the two, and it was the first actual evidence for nails in an ankle bone and not just in wrists. In 1986, after a record-setting drought, there was brought up, dredged up from the sea, a first-century fishing boat An awful lot of the hull still recoverable. And after years of careful work and preservation, you can now go to a place called Gnostic, and an entire museum has been built around this one artifact. Because you have to have a gift shop, and you have to have a place where you watch a movie about it, and you have to have a restaurant, and then you see the boat itself. And Jews know how to bring in Christian tourists. They called it the Jesus boat. Nobody knows whose boat it was. But it was the first absolute proof that boats were built big enough for 13 kind of small people. The average height of a Jewish man in the first century was 5'4", 140 pounds. Women 5 feet 100. That's a bonus. That's free. Caiaphas's tomb was discovered in 1990. Maybe James, the brother of Jesus' ossuary, his bone box, may have been discovered in the early 2000s. There was huge international controversy surrounding it. The Jewish Israeli scholar who brought it to public attention was sued for fraud by a skeptical scholar who couldn't believe this was even possible. It took 10 years to settle it in the court, and he was exonerated of all charges, but that never made any headlines. Doesn't mean the ossuary was authentic. It just means every reason for being skeptical was thrown out of court. A first century home in Nazareth. We don't know whose it was. Somebody there will try to talk you into believing it was Jesus, and much, much more. But what about the book of Acts? I put this slide up not to show you Paul's third missionary journey, but to show you, to remind you of all the different locations, not even all of them, but a lot of the locations that appear, and some that don't, in the book of Acts. In the ancient world, no one wrote historical novels the way Herman Melville did with Moby Dick, who went on whaling expeditions for 2 years to get everything exactly realistic, and then wrote his fictional story about Ishmael and Queequeg and Captain Ahab, conscious reference to King Ahab of the Old Testament. In the ancient world, if you wrote historical fiction, one of the ways you told people you were doing that was you had people like Nebuchadnezzar leading an army in the 2nd century BC, 400 or 500 years too late. And everybody knew it, and they said, oh, he's writing fiction. What you get in the book of Acts are an amazing reference to places, but also an amazing reference to people. Some of them rulers, all of which can be confirmed by other sources outside of Christian literature, occurring somewhere. Could somebody have written fiction in the ancient world and tossed in a few legitimate people and places? Sure. Homer did that in the Iliad and the Odyssey. But to have dozens upon dozens, all accurate, including the names for the specific kind of local rulers. So it's only Thessalonica that had polytarchs. And you say, I don't see that word in my English translation. That's why you need Greek. Or at least you need to read somebody who can read Greek. No, we would say city officials of some kind. It was only the followers of next generation after Herod that were called tetrarchs. It was only Ephesus that had somebody called a city clerk. It was only Athens where the town council, because at one time it had met on Mars Hill, in Greek, Areopagus, was called the Areopagus. It was only on Malta where the head guy was the chief man. Ancient equivalent of head honcho. Luke gets everyone right, including some that within a generation or two after the period described had changed, which if Luke wrote in the 2nd century, like a few very liberal scholars think, would have been highly unlikely he would even have known of what some of these titles originally were. Here are slides that I've pulled out of class context, totally out of context, and no quizzes, no exams based on them. Just watch everything slide in and marvel. Oh, too far. Based on the information in Acts and in Paul's epistles, we can piece together a chronology of Paul's public ministry. I don't think we often think about how significant that is. If Acts were largely fictitious, you wouldn't be able to do this. It wouldn't fit the undisputed letters of Paul, each of which seems to have been written without direct literary dependence on the other. Or we can put together just some key dates and ages of key events in Paul's life. Not just from Acts, not just from his letters. You have to use them both. You would think at some point, if something was fiction, it wouldn't fit together. Now, not everybody agrees on this exact information because at times there are multiple ways to fit it all together. Not because there are impossible contradictions to overcome. What about the epistles? What about the letters of Paul? Well, some of you will be aware. We can put all of them in a plausible chronology. Some of you will be aware that some scholars dispute that Paul wrote certain letters. We can create a chart that has the undisputed letters of Paul, the semi-disputed letters, and the really disputed letters. If we had more time, we could go into the arguments, pro and con, with all of those books. What are we to make of the charges of pseudonymity that not everybody in both Old or New Testament necessarily wrote the books that it seems they were attributed to? What did people in the first century, in early Christianity, think about that? And there are two very different competing answers to that question. On the one hand, there is no doubt that in the intertestamental period between the Old and New Testaments, all kinds of books emerged that were attributed to people as far back as Adam and Eve and just about every major figure of Old Testament history you could imagine. And people didn't take those ascriptions of authorship, for the most part, as anything other than a way of some recent writer choosing a famous figure from antiquity whose work or life or teachings, small I, inspired the contemporary writer's composition of that work. It was as accepted as ghostwriting is in some circles today, or writing up someone's incomplete autobiography after their death. I thought that's what we were going to hear earlier when we had posthumous publications. But we also know that from the mid-2nd century onward, when Christians discovered that something was pseudonymous, this was a defeater for inclusion in the Christian canon. When did the attitude change? Where did the attitudes change? What was 1st century Christian conviction? Was it different in Jewish circles than in Greco-Roman circles? The answer is, we have no evidence. We don't know. The writings haven't been preserved that would answer that question. So was this a device that could have been used by some of Paul's followers to say, these really aren't my thoughts. This is what I learned from Paul. It's what I think he would have said if he were here with you a generation later? Or is it duplicitous? Is it something that we should reject out of hand? I think we've sometimes made too much of this particular issue. Although, having said that, I think a good case can be made that Paul and the other biblical writers wrote everything that's attributed to them. What's more fascinating to me out of Paul are all the places where he appears to be aware of something that Jesus taught. I don't know if you noticed as the numbers went rapidly by, but most of Paul's letters were written in the 50s. Even if you just limit it to the undisputed letters. The first Gospels, probably not until the 60s, at the earliest. So when Paul alludes to something that Jesus taught, he didn't just pull the scroll of the Gospel of Luke off the shelf. He had to have had access to reliable oral tradition. And you can see the topics about marriage, topics about receiving money for ministry, which several people in this room are grateful for. An account of the last night of Jesus' life and the meaning of the bread and the wine, what has come to be called the words of institution. Teaching about Christ's return or second coming. It's unlikely that anybody would have ever attributed to Jesus the notion that he would come like a thief in the night, unless he had said those words first. What's he gonna steal? That's not the point, but it could easily be misunderstood. Or enemy love, not likely to have been invented. We don't obey it today. Other people have made political comments uniformly on one side of the political spectrum. It's not quite that simple. And then key themes. Well, doesn't Paul teach justification by faith? Where do you find that in Jesus? How about the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, where the one went home justified because he said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. It's hard to beat your breast when there's a microphone on it. And, well, Jesus talks a lot about the kingdom of God, but Paul talks about the righteousness of God. Those are different. Till you realize that Jesus taught his followers to pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And what was his will? That we live righteously. The law fulfilled in the commands to love God and neighbor. Whatever you do with contemporary application, which is another issue, very countercultural roles for women, but at least in the first century, stopping just short of complete egalitarianism. Maybe we're to follow that, maybe not, because of cultural reasons, but they're parallel. But it's not only Paul who seems to know what Jesus taught before any of the Gospels were written down. The little letter of James, depending on what you count as an allusion as well as a quotation, probably has conservatively a couple dozen allusions back to the teaching of Jesus, the clearest of which is, let your yes be yes and your no be no, not taking oaths. And James may have been written as early as the late 40s, already showing knowledge of a reliable oral tradition. But doesn't James contradict Paul? Martin Luther wondered, though he never ultimately rejected James. But once you understand that both writers are using words differently, that when James talks about faith, he can say even the demons have faith, and they shudder. Faith for James means orthodox belief about God, Jewish faith, if you want to overly simplify it. And the works that he says are necessary are deeds of Christian love and mercy. When Paul talks about faith, he means trust in Jesus. And when he says it's not by works, it's the works of the law. So both terms are used differently by both authors. And once you realize that, there's no necessary contradiction. We can go fast through the rest of the New Testament. These don't tend to be the issues that are of interest to as many people. Who wrote Hebrews? Great question. Bunch of suggestions have been made, ancient and modern. The right-hand column are modern suggestions. The left-hand column is ancient suggestions. As far as the ancient suggestions go, if it wasn't Paul, they were all followers of Paul. So it's still no further removed from apostolic testimony than, say, the Gospel of Mark following Peter or the Gospel of Luke following Paul. If you learn to read even a little Greek, you will discover that 1st and 2nd Peter are written in utterly distinct styles, such as it's impossible to believe the same person wrote each. but maybe Silas, as the scribe, as the amanuensis, was responsible for putting Peter the Galilean fisherman's less refined Greek language into good Hellenistic Greek. And maybe 2 Peter was written up posthumously because the author seems to think his end is imminent, and he says he will make every effort to see that after my departure, his audience will be able to remember these things. Or maybe just one of those is true. There's probably some kind of literary relationship between Jude and 2 Peter, which is fascinating. Just marvel as these go by quickly. Very similar wording in parallel passages. Probably Jude wrote first, and Peter, in similar circumstances, used and then fleshed out into 3 chapters what Jude dealt with in 1. But let's talk about the books that didn't make it in. Why not canonize the Gnostic literature? We cannot date them confidently, despite various people's speculation, to anything earlier than the mid-2nd century. They regularly show signs of being aware of and changing or distorting the New Testament teaching. Their Jesus is docetic. He only seems to be human. The God of the Old Testament is either ignored or assumed to be evil. And despite select passages being popular in some feminist circles, if you put the whole corpus together, it's very elitist, often not always just made up of men, and pretty secretive. What about the New Testament Apocrypha? It's also late. It fills in perceived gaps in the New Testament. What was Jesus like as a boy? But it just makes up very fanciful miracles. It can have a very different theology, sometimes very world-denying or ascetic. And what's interesting is that in the ancient debates about the canon, the books that were occasionally suggested that didn't make it in were none of these. They were otherwise Orthodox 2nd century Christian writings. What about those mysterious textual variants? See what I mean about just giving you a barrage of stuff? Well, only 2 of them span 12 verses, the longer ending of Mark, the story of the woman caught in adultery. Only a couple dozen more are even 1 or 2 verses in length. With over 5,700 pre-Gutenberg Greek manuscripts in existence, if somebody were to find something new, they'd have to explain how did it not appear in this huge manuscript tradition. It would almost certainly have to be idiosyncratic and not authentic. More than 99% of the text can be reconstructed beyond any serious doubt, and no significant Christian doctrine depends on any disputed text. For some people, the issue is the canon. We could have a blast with this one for a long time. If you come to Denver Seminary, please learn that this kind of canon has one N in it. I tire of papers, especially by graduating seniors, that spell the canon C-A-N-N-O-N. But they can't spell deity either, or... And lead as a past tense is L-E-D. Do all of you know that? Everybody writes L-E-A-D. It's like, well, anyway, I digress. Was it Constantine, the first Christian emperor, that created all this at the Council of Nicaea? No, that's Dan Brown's fiction. Nicaea was about the Trinity. It had nothing to do with the canon. And I've had students at Metro State and CU Boulder and DU tell me that religious studies professors have taught them in class that Nicaea was about the canon. You will not find that in any pre-2004 book, because nobody had invented it yet. Dan Brown made it up. This is the world we live in. 2nd century Christians. Constantine was 323. 4th century already saw unique authority in 1st century documents. Roman persecution and Gnostic challenges required a response in the 2nd century. And there are no known debates about any of the Gospels, Acts, or the letters of Paul, 1 Peter, or 1 John. Wow. It's the other little bitty ones in Revelation, which is just weird, that get debated. And the criteria involve apostolicity and orthodoxy and Catholicity. And I'm going to do what JP did last night, because I'm already beyond my time and my mandate, and say, going right to the very last slide, that no, I don't think history, and this is the first talk that has been about history, not about philosophy or science or art. In history, you can't have mathematical certainty. You can only have degrees of probability. There are going to be things that you have to accept by faith. But is it faith in spite of the evidence? I sometimes try to imagine somebody running down a track for a long jump pit and then screeching to a halt like the roadrunner as Coyote goes past, jumping up the air and flinging their body back in the other direction. Let's have that competition. Or is it like a kid at the Denver Zoo just starting out with no momentum and seeing how far he can jump and seeing what animal he jumped as far as? Or is it running down the track with momentum building you into the right direction? But at best, all history can do is suggest a general reliability. The rest, you have to give somebody the benefit of the doubt when he's trustworthy, where he can be tested. So I failed like everybody else failed, but we still have 10 minutes. Talk back. Come to the mics.
My question for you, the book you've written on this is about yay thick, so you've got
sad.
A handful of objections that you deal with. I'm wondering, is there one objection to the reliability, specifically of the New Testament, where you find that we don't really have an answer that in your mind is suitable?
Do I sound overly confident if I say no?
No.
I don't. Well, good. We can have a lot of questions at this rate.
I'm wondering what the early church fathers thought about the authenticity of the scriptures and so on. In other words, were they pretty confident? Did they express any doubt about those kinds of things?
Yeah. 2 Peter is the one book out of the 27 that there was a fair amount of doubt, even in the earliest eras, whether or not Peter actually wrote it. And then, of course, there was a different kind of conversation about Hebrews, because in none of the early manuscripts was there any claim of authorship, so debate was about who wrote them. But those were a tiny bit surrounding Revelation, because you have somebody called John, but he's just called John the seer or the revealer, and we don't know which John. But the other books that were doubted, the other 4 that occasionally had a little bit of doubt, 2nd, 3rd John and Jude, just because they're all so short and pretty situation specific. Are these really timelessly as valuable as, say, Romans? And then James is the only other one, for the same reason that Luther later would struggle with it, because it seemed to be in tension with Paul. The rest, there's almost no indication of questions at all.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll keep walking from side to side.
Are there any Gnostics that obviously didn't get put in the canon? That
Gnostic people?
no,
Oh,
the Gospels or writings that you thought
okay.
This could check out, and it's fine it didn't get in, but it could.
The gospel attributed to Thomas, that is probably the most famous of the Gnostic writings, which is not a narrative as we think of gospel. It is a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, sometimes with no narrative connection between them at all. Ballpark figures, about 50% are pretty clearly Gnostic. About a third are pretty close to something that we find in the canon and may have just been modified or distorted a little bit. And the remaining smallest fraction of all, what's that leave? A sixth? Are the kinds of sayings that when you read them with no context, since they aren't given one, there was a parable. And Jesus said the kingdom of the Father is like a strong man who wanted to kill his enemy, and so he took his sword and he thrust it into his wall. Now you got to have an adobe hut for this to make sense. Until he was strong enough. And then he went out and slew his enemy. Well, reminds us a little bit of the binding of the strong man in Mark 3. There's nothing unorthodox about it. I could give it a perfectly orthodox spin. It's kind of like counting the cost. Be prepared. If you want to kill somebody, make sure you got your muscles and your sword working well. The same for spiritual warfare in the kingdom of God. But I could probably find a way to give it an unorthodox spin. There's another parable. The kingdom of the Father is like a woman who had a jar of meal. She was walking down the road. A hole formed in the bottom of the jar. The meal began to fall out. She didn't notice. She got home. The jar was empty. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. What does it mean? Guard the spiritual treasure you've been given so you don't lose it? That could be orthodox. Guard the secret revelation that Gnosticism gives you so that you don't lose it? It's hard to know. There are a handful of sayings like that, but not much else. time for somebody to be over here. Here he comes, good.
I might be not remembering this guy's names right, but I think it's
okay.
Steve Allen Black has the theory that Matthew was actually written before Mark, and then Mark is kind of used to confirm Luke as a gospel.
Mm-hmm.
I was just curious what your thoughts are on that kind of explanation.
There are half a dozen other ways. In fact, going back to our math and science part of the conference, if you take a triangle and figure out every possible way you can put Matthew, Mark, or Luke in relationships, somebody's argued for it. Maybe the third most popular view among scholars, and numbers 2 and 3 are a very distant second and third from what we showed, is that Matthew and Luke wrote independently and early, and Mark came along as an epitomizer of the two. And we know that ancient historians often took longer works and made abridgments of them. So that theory is not implausible, but Mark does not read like an abridgment. It's shorter. It's only 2/3 the length of either Matthew or Luke, but if Mark was abridging even just one of the two Gospels, he would have taken all of Jesus' great sermons and shrunk them or deleted them, most of his most famous parables, and omitted them. And then where he does run parallel to Matthew or Luke, he is usually the longest. That's not the way you normally abbreviate something. So I'm not as convinced, but good people have been, and I will not be martyred for a particular view of the synoptic problem. Hey, this works.
I think you mentioned Greco-Roman biography in your notes, and
Probably.
Mike Licona
Yeah.
at HBU do some work on that,
Yeah.
studying Plutarch's Lives.
Right.
And he talks about compositional devices.
He does indeed.
Compression, transferal, and displacement are some that he mentions. Would you say a few words about those and how they differ from today's standards of recording events?
Yeah. In the ancient world, I started down that road, but that's all I did with any of the topics, was start down the road. You might talk about a person's birth if there was something special about it, but you didn't need to. You rarely talked about their childhood or their upbringing, maybe a few bare bones facts. A lot of people believed in the ancient Greco-Roman world that the best window onto who you were as a person was how you died. And so the events immediately preceding someone's death were often narrated in the greatest amount of detail. If you're talking about somebody who was a famous teacher, it was common to create a collection of their most famous teachings and just give them to you in a block. Or they would go topic by topic. Or if somebody was a military general, they might give a synopsis of their greatest victories. It wasn't necessarily always chronological, though often it was, and general chronology. And then as you recounted events, you had complete freedom to abbreviate, to expand, to select, to add your own interpretive commentary to events, to phrase other people's words in your own words. Mike has demonstrated what others have previously, but probably he's done it in more detail, that you find all of these devices in other ancient biographers. You find them in the Gospels. Mike also, at times, not all that often, seems to suggest that for incidental details, and he's probably right with respect to Plutarch, If the author didn't know something, he just made up something that seemed like it would fit. I'm not as convinced that you can find the gospel writers ever doing that, so we have some intramural disagreements there. But overall, his work is an amazing work of scholarship and very helpful. Last question. No pressure.
So I just want to say I'm a big fan of your work, especially the maximal case for the historicity of the resurrection.
Bless you.
I'm a big fan of Tim and Lydia McGrew's work on undesign coincidences. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that for a second and discuss how it may be important to things like the synoptic problem.
Maybe not as much to the synoptic problem as just to the historical reliability of various texts. Here's a great example, one of the best ones, I think. You can find it in any one of the synoptic gospels, but what finally got Jesus before the Sanhedrin on trial for his life? We read in Mark 14:55, the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. That's the problem when you get people to say something made up. Then someone stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with hands. You ever ask yourself, of the 2,075 roughly things that Jesus could have been accused of, just a made up number, why pick that? There is nothing in the synoptics to suggest he said any. Well, it's true at the beginning of Mark 13, he does predict not one stone here will be left on another, but he doesn't say anything about a new temple. He doesn't say anything about his involvement with that. You have to go back to, or ahead to, in canonical order, back in time, to John chapter 2, to an incident in the temple that seems strikingly similar to what happened that Palm Sunday, and yet with a lot of differences as well. And the key difference comes in verse 19. When Jesus says, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. And he was talking about the temple of his body, but it says not even the disciples understood him until after the resurrection. That's the type of statement that could be remembered in garbled form 2 years later, when nobody cared about an oral tradition of Jesus' sayings by his opponents and brought forward as false testimony. A sort of undesigned coincidence in which John confirms the synoptics. Sometimes it goes the other way around. Lydia has a new book out that I wrote a little blurb for in which she gives a number of those examples, and I think some of them are very good.